Hello, everyone. Welcome again. Thank you for being here with us today, the fourth day of our International Journalism Week. This evening, we are pleased to welcome Valerie Biden Owens, chair of the Biden Institute at the University of Delaware. Valerie, as you may already know, is the first woman in US history to have run a presidential campaign, that of her brother, Joe Biden. For the last 20 years, when Valerie was not managing President Biden's campaigns, she served as executive vice president of a media consulting firm advising a diverse range of politicians on how to effectively use the media to win campaigns and pass legislation. Valerie is the New York Times best-selling author of Growing Up Biden. Joining Valerie on the stage is Christian Amanpour. Christian Amanpour, CNN's chief international anchor and host of the network's award-winning flagship global affairs program, Amanpour. In addition to her work as a reporter, Christiane is a board member of the Committee to Protect Journalists, the Center for Public Integrity, and the International Women's Media Foundation. Of course, Christiane has been a long inspiration for many journalists, from her fearless reporting in war zones to her standing up to world leaders, as she recently demonstrated in her refusal to comply with the president of Iran's demand on her to wear a headscarf in a television interview. So we're very honored having you with us tonight, Christiane. Welcome. Valerie will ask Christiane to share some stories from her experience and observations in the field on the role of media in democracy. This conversation, I have to add, that is presented by the Biden School Stavros Niarchos Foundation Ithaka Initiative to Advance Democracy. Valerie and the Biden School's SNF Ithaka team, as you already know, have played an active role in our IMED First International Journalism Week since day one by A, leading a workshop on citizens journalism, B, by hosting the discussion about to start, and C, as well as bringing together university students from the field of political sciences to share perspectives from young people preparing to be leaders in diverse fields. And tomorrow, we will welcome their report and their results regarding our forum and regarding whatever they have heard during this conference. So, Valerie, Christiane, thank you once more for being here with us today. Please, we're waiting and looking forward for your discussion.
Pretty cool, huh?
Yeah. Thank you, Anna.
Oh, excuse me, I'm going to be very formal and professional here. Athens, it is right and fitting that we should be here at the seat of democracy. You know, the Athenian democracy, 6th century BC. And we're here talking about free speech. And there are two words that I am trying to pronounce that I want to focus on today. And they're Greek words. So pretend you know what I'm saying, okay? Isigoria and parasia. And one means equal and uninhibited speech. And that, did I say it right? Anybody's Greek, did it sound right? Okay, I was very worried. The playwright Euripides used the term to describe Athens, and free speech is the foundation of journalism in democracy. Mm-hmm. So with that, hail to and thanks to Athens and to SNF for having us here, and IMED. I'd like to talk about you, young lady. You're in the hot seat. Okay? So let's dive in. There are a lot of young journalists here. And tell us about how did you get here? Tell us about your role, the evolution of a young journalist.
Well, it wasn't obvious. I didn't start out wanting to be a journalist. You know, people always say, did you always want to be a journalist since you were a kid? And the answer is a resounding no, because frankly, I didn't know what journalism was. I grew up in Iran under a monarchy where we didn't have a free journalism, field, and it was all state journalism, and I grew up watching the TV, and every day there'd be these fabulous sort of hymnals to the Shah. And in every newspaper, it would be how great the Shah is. And the truth is, he did do a lot of great things. But there was no criticism, there was no talk, there was no investigation. So I did not realize what journalism was. But it was the Iranian Revolution, which I actually lived through in 1978, that made me want to be a journalist, because I thought I wanted to be a doctor. I didn't get good enough grades to go to medical school. And so I was wandering around in the wilderness, and meaning I was staying with my parents at home and trying to figure out, what to make of my life. And watching this incredible event, which had such massive global consequences, unfold in front of my eyes and on my doorstep was just, I couldn't even believe what I was seeing. And then I started to think, well, this is so interesting. And I knew it's some big journalism names in the United States and in the UK, etc. And I said, well, I want to do that. And I didn't really know what that meant. So I decided I would go to university in the United States, and essentially the rest is a very carefully plotted route from university to internships to the local channel to CNN, and then to doing what I'm doing now. But that's how I came, sort of the accidental journalist.
But it's interesting because you fell in, it's kind of serendipity that you fell into journalism because of the revolution. But an important thing that you mentioned is that they were very focused steps.
Yep.
That you had a plan, and you...
Absolutely, and for all those here who are in that position right now, if any of you are trying to figure out how to get to be a journalist, I think things are very different now. I started 39 years ago at CNN, so this month, 39 years at CNN, but at the very, very bottom, I mean really at the very, very bottom, to the extent that I was actually bringing coffee and snacks to my boss. And in between, I did a little journalism, which meant sort of transcribing my colleagues' scripts into the mainframe, into the in-house computer, taking in what we call feeds, all the videos that were coming from around the world, and I was just mesmerized. And I have to say, I wasn't actually encouraged. When I was doing my first job at CNN, I did not have a very encouraging immediate boss. My higher up kind of thought I was just loony to want to be a foreign correspondent. But
and a woman, too. You were rare, weren't you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was rare as a woman back then, but more to the point, I had no experience as a foreign correspondent, obviously, but I was ready to do and take the steps that you had to. And by the way, it was fun. It was really fun making my way in the world, because when you start at the very bottom and you learn everything as you go up, you develop a sense of confidence and a sense of expertise. And expertise is not a dirty word, although it's become a bit of a dirty word in recent history. But I really, bonded with my team and everything, my colleagues coming up through the ranks. And it was very important for me to know what I was doing as I went out in the field.
I don't think there's anyone who would describe you who, among the first words, wouldn't say that you are a straight shooter. You tell it like it is. And as a foreign correspondent, you've had an eyewitness view of history in the making and of journalism. And what goes along with that as a foreign correspondent, which she is not going to say, is bravery. And that requires bravery. I'm not just talking about physical bravery, and it does on the battlefield, where the wars that you've stood on the ground reporting on wars, but it's also moral bravery, where you've stood on the ground defending your principles. Now, you're not going to tell me how brave you are. I am saying to everyone, she is brave. Will you tell me a story? Will you tell me something about some of the tough choices physically on the battlefield, or morally on principle?
Well, when you go into this, you don't really realize that you're going to have to be brave. But the fact is, you are going to have to be brave because you do have to get in the middle of a war zone. One of the great illustrations to me is when we first all started getting on the planes to go to Iraq before the U.S. invasion. Not a great experience. We can talk about that later. But that was in 2003, and all in the airports, certainly in the UK, they were saying, we advise passengers not to go to the Middle East right now, not to go to anywhere near Iraq or in that area. And it just occurred to me that, what we do is run towards when everybody else is running away. That I hadn't really clocked at the very beginning when I started, which was the early 90s, was my first foreign correspondent. I was in the first Gulf War and then in Bosnia. So just to say that Bosnia probably was my first real instruction on what it took to tell the truth. And I guess the truth for me was something that I obviously learned what it meant in journalism, and we can talk about that in a bit, but I grew up in a Catholic household. My father was Muslim, my mother was British Catholic. And I grew up knowing that if I didn't tell the truth, I was going to be in trouble.
Yeah.
And so it kind of carried me in my job sort of subconsciously. But I remember in Bosnia, it was the very, very first time in the history of war journalism that we were actual deliberate targets. Part of that is because CNN...
You as a journalist.
As journalists of all stripes were deliberate targets, because there was very clearly one side and another side. There was the aggressors who wanted to carve out a territory out of land that wasn't theirs and create a greater Serbia in this case. And to do that, conducted this thing called ethnic cleansing, which was moving people off land, which eventually became genocide because they also killed a lot of people in order to do that. And what we had to figure out was, what actually were we seeing? So that's the first thing. You have to know what you're seeing in order to be able to actually report it. That this wasn't just some humanitarian crisis, it was actually a political experiment and a political mission of one side. So just to say that because they all saw CNN at that time, CNN was just really huge on the international stage in the early 90s, everybody could see what we were doing in real time. And those who we were outing, so to speak, who we were exposing for doing bad things, did not like it and literally wanted to shoot the messenger. I mean, literally.
Well, you lost friends.
We had friends, lost them to, many were wounded, many were killed. So that was something that we really had to pay close attention to.
Were you smart enough to be scared?
Not at that time. I wasn't, yes, I was sensitized to the danger, but not crippled by fear at that time. And then in the more, I guess, the more moral universe, whatever the right word is, I do remember having to talk very, very specifically and in a difficult way to world leaders and ask them essentially over and again why on their watch, especially democracies who believe in human rights, especially after World War II, because this was the first time in since World War II that this kind of genocide was happening in Europe. When they said never again, I learned that in history and I was watching it again. So I was confused. How were our leaders actually allowing this to happen? So when I got my chance to actually ask the President of the United States, who at the time was President Clinton, and it was a two-way. So President Clinton was actually starting I think he was doing a foreign policy town hall at CNN. I believe it was leading up to his second was it? No, anyway, it was somewhere in the middle. It was 94, something like that. He was doing a foreign policy town hall, and I had to ask him a question. CNN had chosen 4 correspondents in different parts of the world, and I was in Sarajevo, and I kept listening to what he was saying about what the US was doing to help, in Bosnia. And it all amounted mostly to humanitarian aid, which was essentially, this is my opinion, fattening up people to the slaughter. That's how I felt, because they were not doing anything to stop the war. So I asked him, Mr. President, it's a great honor to interview, and it was a great honor to ask him a question from Sarajevo, but I said to him, don't you think your administration's constant flip-flops on Bosnia, and that you don't have a policy, but you are having to follow the policy of the one entity that does have a policy, which are the aggressors, that this is,
How'd that go over?
It didn't go over very well. He said, there have been no constant flip-flops, madam. And from there on, any time I went to interview a world leader, they called me madam first and foremost. So it was a little bit of an inside joke. But
paybacks are hell.
Yeah. But even my bosses and even members of my family were not happy with me. They thought I'd been disrespectful. They thought I had been, had overdone it. They thought I had, as one of my bosses said, I'll tell you a question instead of ask you a question. It did go on. I will admit, it was a bit of a long question, but it cemented my belief that you have to ask tough questions, and if you get one chance to ask a tough question, you better ask it because you're not going to get many other chances.
A little sidebar to that. Do you think that the criticism of you was more or less harsh because you were a woman?
I don't think so. I think I just pissed him off.
Okay, way to go. That's my girl. You speak
and
about...
I will say, Valerie, and it's got nothing to do with me, but President Clinton eventually realized that it was an untenable situation.
And you know who was very instrumental in...
Well, I didn't want to say,
yeah.
But then Senator Biden.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Who had visited the area and who had brought back the facts that actually a superpower like the United States, in the middle of democratic Europe, could not allow that to keep happening. And they did, in 1995, get serious, and they made sure the war ended, they did the Dayton peace process, and then in Kosovo, they made preventative intervention so that that kind of genocide would not happen in Kosovo as it did in Bosnia.
But the interesting thing is that you kept the string going the whole time, and before the final decision, you were always talking about it, you were always bringing it up. You speak about truth and trust in journalism, and I have a quote here. Actual democracies are in a way that we could never have imagined backsliding their own political systems. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, well, that's where we find ourselves right now. But I would want to go back to what you opened with, which is acknowledging that we sit in the birthplace of modern democracy. And I learned throughout my reporting, whether it was in Bosnia or even in Iran or other places throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, that actually journalists in many, many parts of the world, and I'm talking about local journalists, were on the forefront, the front lines of reform and democracy in their countries, and pushing the ball forward to bring freedom, first freedom of expression, obviously, but freedom in general terms. And I genuinely do believe in the American sort of slogan that we in the press are the fourth estate. We don't have that. We don't have that, in any other part of the world.
Most of us believe in America
but it's
now.
a very serious responsibility.
Yeah.
And I do actually believe that nations with very, very developed media and a free media uphold democracy, and those that don't have a healthy, democracy, or their systems are not healthy. Without free journalism, systems are not healthy.
Well, you talk about another quote that I picked out from your work, is you talk about journalism in decline. Mm-hmm. And what are the components? What makes journalism in decline? What are the aspects of that?
Well, to go back to the second part of your question, we live in a world right now, whether it's in the United States, in parts of Europe, and in many other parts of the world, where authoritarianism and backsliding in democracy is definitely happening at warp speed, like I could never have imagined. And so our jobs, I believe, are even more important right now. But at the same time, what we have are sort of counter-currents, cross-currents. For instance, just a big for instance, we're all under economic pressure. Essentially journalism is also a business, right? And that means there are a lot of cuts. It means you can't go so deep. Yeah, sometimes it's wide and not so deep. I think local news, for instance, in the United States is being cut, and that's not healthy. We need to have the wherewithal to be able to travel the world and do more than just one story. Good journalism does cost money. And the other side of that is that bad journalism doesn't cost money. So you can actually sit in your bedroom with your pajamas on and pretend to be a journalist, especially with all the proliferations of platforms that we have right now. Social media platforms, blogs, all those things. Some are really, really good, and come to us from parts of the world that maybe we don't have access to ourselves. For instance, in Iran right now, right? A lot of what's coming out of Iran right now is through social media. None of us in the international press are there. They have closed the doors to us. Therefore, we are reliant on what's coming out from very brave people there who are going on social media. But the bad part of that is that social media has also been responsible for the decline in trust, in truth, in accuracy, and in all of that. And we have to fight against that all the time.
We had to do that in America in the 1950s. There was a period called McCarthyism, Senator McCarthy. And I remember when I was a little girl, my mom, when I'd come home from school, my mom would be ironing, watching the TV and watching Senator McCarthy and her saying, he's a disgrace to every Irish man. That was her, it was just a disgrace.
All politics are local.
Yes, And so McCarthyism, for those, I don't know if you're all familiar with it, but it's the practice that endorses the use of unfair allegations and investigations. So you can say anything or do anything, and it was about, it was the Red Scare, it was about communists in the 1950s. With that being said, how do you differentiate what men and women, powerful men and women in business and in politics, what you as the journalist, a woman of integrity, you know it to be false, what they are saying. Do you have an obligation to print or go on, publish what they are saying because they are, quote, an important person, or not?
How do you navigate that?
Yeah.
Well, going back to McCarthyism, and I think this is a really important point. So that was the witch hunt. I mean, he just lied outright and destroyed people's lives and created a straw man. There was just not, that thing that he was saying didn't exist in the United States. And I have to say, it was a couple of prominent news organizations. I can't remember exactly which. I think CBS may have been one of them under Edward R. Murrow, and also maybe a newspaper. It was either Denver or Detroit, either the Detroit Free Press or Denver. But anyway, they decided that they were no longer going to print or broadcast what he said unless they could hold him to a standard that would, for instance, be the standard that you would present in court. You have to present the truth, facts that are backed up. So they took a stand back then, and when they did take a stand and he was off the air and off the front lines, or rather the headlines, the power of what he said began to diminish. This is really important. Journalists took the lead in diminishing and taking the sting out of a lot of the effect of McCarthyism. So I think that's really, really important. Coming to today, or the direct question you asked me, if I know something to be a lie, I would never repeat it and I would never report it, except to put it to that person and to have them respond, which I have done many times. But I would never, there's nothing in our doctrine or in our rule book that says that we have to print, the lies that X, Y, or Z says, which is not to say that doesn't happen.
Yeah, why is it happening?
Okay, so you're probably talking about President Trump, who basically...
Not me.
No. But Trumpism is not just a political issue of Democrat versus Republican. It's an issue of truth and facts versus, lies and deceits and conspiracies. And so we all have to deal with it.
Is it just news, though? I mean, is it a lie? Like, wow, that's news. How do you...
Well, you see, here's the thing. Trump got a huge amount of amplification because of social media. So Twitter was his way forward. But what I hadn't realized is that I don't even know how many it is now, but back then, during the campaign of 2015, 2016, I think there was something like only 20 million Americans on Twitter. I don't know whether that's true, but that's... People said... Anyway, it wasn't all of America, and it wasn't all of the world. But the established press amplified it by always reporting what he had said on Twitter. So that went around the world like wildfire. And that created a momentum of its own. And if you take that into places like the Philippines or India or Myanmar or wherever, social media in many places equals the news. When people don't have news organizations that they trust or are in any way evolved, they will get their news from social media. But we all know now, maybe we didn't know earlier, but it's been clearly revealed that social media exists by enlarging and broadcasting enragement, because that's the way they get clicks. So it's clickbait, engagement.
And therefore the mainstream news media
Well,
has to
I disagreed with it. I basically said, I questioned, at that time, our bosses, why do we keep saying what's going on Twitter? They said, well, it's news. I said, it's only news if we're going to dig deep to find out whether it's true or not what he puts on Twitter. And then, people did, that we had plenty of panels and journalists, and people held him accountable. But it was the momentum and the tsunami was too big for us to think that we could manage. Once we'd opened the gates, this is just me talking now, once we'd opened the gates, we couldn't corral it anymore. And it became sui generis, it became its own thing, which it still exists. So now, for instance, Trumpism went to Brazil. So Trump advisors went to Brazil to advise Bolsonaro. And one of the pieces of advice was, if you lose, challenge it. Don't admit defeat. And all of that kind of stuff. Now, Bolsonaro has done better in the first round than anybody expected. We'll see what happens in the second round and whether he accepts. But it's a very, very difficult situation right now, having to manage the untrammeled use of social media, which are not bound by the rules that we're bound by. We have rules in established journalism that we have to apply.
There are two terms which are phrases which are bounced around. One is alternative facts, which are different than facts, which we have seen.
But remember, that was just created by a very clever marketing manager. Kellyanne Conway used it. I believe she was the first one to put it. And then we all glom onto it. There aren't alternative facts. There are facts and there are lies.
Whataboutism, that's your word. Tell us about that.
But I am sure that there are a lot of people who despair and wonder where and if there is a truth. And again, that is a really unfortunate byproduct of the place that we're in right now. If I could say anything to anybody to keep people's spirits up, there is truth, you just have to know where to find it. And if you all want to find truth in places that you can trust in the media landscape, you all have to do your homework as well. It's not just on us anymore. You know where the trusted outlets are. People who've been doing this job for decades and decades and decades and decades in terms of organizations, and who employ journalists who are honest and truthful, hardworking journalists.
But let me challenge you. I heard you in an interview just recently. You talked about the social media, and it was a superhighway.
Yeah.
And I'm paraphrasing this, so I probably have screwed some of it up. But basically, now there are on this superhighway, which can spread this information around the globe, which is a wonderful gift. but there's so many exit ramps
Yeah.
now, and you get off the exit ramp where people think like you.
Yep.
And so you're talking to you're in an
Yep.
echo chamber. And so what do we do?
Well, you have to decide that you want to get other information. Nobody can force you anymore. There's just so much out there. And the worst thing is that it's all algorithmic now. It's not even people. I mean, tech people know this much better than I do. I'm not very techy. But people are being directed into this funnel of information, and because all our data is public and people use it and throw back to you what you throw out. And so it's this, what I call vicious circle. And in order to try to find some virtue in that vicious circle, there's a huge new onus and responsibility on the consumer, which is, the capitalist way of saying viewer, listener, podcast, podcaster, all the rest of it. People who want to know the facts have really, you can go everywhere, but don't trust everything, is what I think.
Well, the 24-hour news cycle, which CNN was the birthplace of that,
Yeah.
right? Is that correct?
Yes, well, in television for sure. There was always the BBC World Service,
Yes,
which was, hugely useful to so many people in so many parts of the world. But when Ted Turner created CNN, he tried to he wanted to do it to break the monopoly that just 3 major networks had in the United States on TV news, which was ABC, CBS, NBC. And he said, no, why shouldn't there be more? So he provided that, which was really a huge development in the media landscape, and he did create a media revolution. And then when he took it internationally, so that was June 1st, 1980, then 5 years later he took it internationally, and that also was an amazing thing, because for people around the world, there were many countries that did not have an independent media, and many that only had state-run media.
Yeah.
And so people who were able to access CNN even in those countries, which they could because it was on satellite and elsewhere, so if clever people could all download it, even if it wasn't on their channels, obviously, and they could suddenly get another view of what was going on, different to what their government, usually a dictatorship or an authoritarian government, was telling them. Because the one thing that is power is information. Information is power, which is why so many people are trying to figure out how to harness it for better and, sadly, for worse. So
What about the criticism, the critique of the 24-hour news cycle?
Yep.
That there's not 24 hours worth of new news. So that it's now being filled with things that are not up to the highest journalistic standards.
Yeah,
Do you have a...
well, I do know, and maybe people still think that certainly CNN gets some criticism around the world for being on a repeated loop. But just doing a lot of the same stories every hour, which is true. It's true, because there isn't enough to fill 24 hours necessarily. But on the other hand, we're not filling it with garbage. There was a time during the 4 years of the Trump administration when in CNN in the USA, we had a lot of panels, and we tried to get alternate voices and the like. But we're pulling back from that and trying to do more just fact-based reportage. And the world is in a time right now, whether it's the war, between Russia's war on Ukraine, whether it's the, cost of living, the inflation, the pandemic. We're in a time when it's all about news, and we need facts. We need facts to be able to make decisions on our lives.
Did you have, in the course of your career, have you ever had one of those come to Jesus meetings, when the difference is whether or not to report something that you're not quite sure about, and then your own conscience saying a censorship? There's a sweet spot between censorship and your decision of what to report or how to report it. Were there some real?
Let's say you're in a location overseas. It's maximum confusion. There's war. There's disaster, pestilence. famine, the rest. Sometimes you get stories that come to you from who knows where, and you think, wow, that's unbelievable. I better get out there and say it right now. But then you have to I'm not going to say censor because that's not what I mean. You have to wait to be able to fact check it and know that it's actual truth and then put it out. We do get a lot that comes into us that ends up not being accurate, So we really do. In order to be trusted, we actually can't go out and, regurgitate everything that comes in instantly. We used to have a saying at CNN, we want to be first, but we want to be right. We want to be right first.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? So it's important because, sometimes you think, oh my God, this is too good to let somebody else get.
Yeah.
But unless we've fact-checked it and confirmed it, we can't put it out.
But being an ambitious, in the best sense of the word, and competent journalist, there has to be such a rush that you want to get that first break or that first story, and there's got to be a lot of that Catholic schoolgirl conscience in your head.
Yeah, but also I know that if I say something that's really wrong on a big issue, it's going to affect my reputation and it's going to affect how people, consume what I'm telling them in the future. I'm very careful about that. I really feel that we who have this incredible platform, and being at CNN, it's a huge platform. I mean, it's global. It's in your face 24/7. It's where the whole world turns when there is something happening. The whole world turns to CNN first, and then maybe branches off into their own other places of choice. But for a period of time, and for that period of time, we have to get it right, because that is what our currency is. And therefore, no, I'm not going to risk not getting it right.
And in 2022, there are so many platforms where people can say so many different things for so many different reasons. And so, do you have any pearls of wisdom of what can be done to help the public distinguish between fake news? And by the way, would you explain, you said there are two kinds of fake news, so that's one part of the story. But do you have any pearls of wisdom of how you figure out what's fake news or what's disinformation, what's downright lie, and what's...
Yeah, so I think when I said there's two kinds of fake news, there's one kind of fake news which is out and out lies, and then there's the other kind of fake news which is an actual, organized, usually very sophisticated propaganda. And the Russians, before that the Soviets, were the masters in this. They literally are so good at this that they altered a lot of information in the United States. For instance, the whole thing about President Kennedy being killed by the CIA, that originated as a Russian, at that time, they didn't have bots and all the rest of it, but they put it in I want to say, if I'm not mistaken, in a newspaper in India, and then it started to snowball and all the rest of it. The whole thing about, there was a lot of misinformation about AIDS and things like that. A lot of that at that time was carefully placed in order to destabilize what was an enemy then, the United States. And let's not forget that governments which have an immense ability in the tech sphere, it's called war by other means. So those who are sophisticated enough to know how to conduct war other than militarily use all these things. It used to be called propaganda. Now it's called disinformation in the digital media, social media age. And there are certain entities that are really very, very good at it. And it's very dangerous because actually you don't recognize it. Yes. Unless you're watching for it. So all I can say, I mean, it may sound self-serving, and in the end it is self-serving, but people have to go to sources that are trustworthy, that have, I said a minute ago, that have the good housekeeping seal of approval. If anybody gets that.
Maybe they're old enough to know what that means.
Or the Starbucks. I don't know. What's the best known and most. It has to pass the test of time and accuracy. And there are many, many organizations that do that all over the world. There are organizations, newspapers in France, in Italy, here, there, everywhere. There are, the CNN, BBC, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, whatever. These organizations deal in fact. And they have journalists who they send out around the world and around their countries to bring about the facts. And then they spend hours and days sometimes fact-checking and making sure their investigations hold up and cross-interviewing. It's a huge job, but it's something that we take really, really, really seriously. And those of us who have committed to that should be your destinations. That is what should be. For instance, in the New York Times just recently, they came up with this. You've probably seen it, and it's amazing. They have intercepted and been given transcripts and sound of Russian soldiers speaking to friends in the field and to their partners or friends or family at home. It's incredible, but it's taken them months, the New York Times, to put that out. This is from March. We're only seeing it now. It's taken them months to fact-check everything. And even now, CNN, we only, for instance, all the Twitter feeds that are coming out of Iran with all the uprisings, we won't put it on the air unless our special, we call it standards and practices, and it's called the ROW as well, which is our fact-checking and daily, minute-by-minute checking before we put things on the air. They have to verify every one of these videos that we put on the air. We don't just go from somebody putting it on Twitter to going on CNN. And nor does the BBC, and nor do others. So it's a big, big job, and it's become much more difficult and time-consuming.
And there's a responsibility on the other end, which is greater than ever before, which is the consumer.
Yeah.
We came here, with the University of Delaware students, and John Della Volpe, who's a friend of mine, and also, and besides being a friend of mine, in his own right, he's a very a significant pollster and works with the youth at the Institute of Politics at Harvard. And he's been conducting some focus groups here. And one of the things that he told me, and I want to get it straight here, he said social media and the news is correlated with increased mental health concerns, and that youth tell us news is often unapproachable, meaning it is focused on the extremes, so that there is a tremendous stress level with youth and social media, which drives in the extreme to mental health or depression and mental illness, and that they want media to take this seriously. So do you have any, first of all, did I say that represent you correctly, John?
Yes, thank you, Valerie. Yeah, and over the course of the last couple of weeks, we've had a series of conversations with students from around the world, and it's an epidemic that in our country, half of this generation, 70 million young Americans, half tell us more days than not over the last 2 weeks, they've suffered from some serious kind of depression, hopelessness. 25% say it's so bad they've considered self-harm.
And that's specifically because of the information they're consuming?
Generally.
In general.
There is therefore, in addition to that, there is a correlation between the number of alerts they're getting on the phone and this degree of depression. And it's a challenge because in one way, they are the most engaged generation we've seen in 70 years, on one hand. On the other hand, the news in some cases is making them ill.
Is this related with COVID also, a fallout from COVID?
It actually started well before COVID, Valerie. We started to pick this up in 2017, this whiplash effect between the change,
Do you know what happened? What was it in 2017?
Well, I think there's several things, but I think it's this whiplash around from
The
Obama
election.
to
Got it.
Trump.
Oh yes,
and the
2017,
fear
right
and the
after.
concern. So those are among the factors.
So, okay. So obviously I have opinions about this, and not based on on empirical data that you have. I'm fascinated to hear that. The more data I get, the more I like, because I know that, you know, you can actually speak about things in substantive ways. So I would just say that I'm not surprised. And the reason I'm not surprised is not because of the news, because the news has always been what it's been. You know, news by its, I'm sorry to say, news is bad usually. It's war, it's disaster, it's a financial crash, it's an epidemic. And our job is designed to tell you this stuff in a way that's accessible and that you can figure out how to deal with it in your lives. But because of the platforms and the destabilizers of disinformation and all the rest of it, it has become a high-stress environment, and I'm really not surprised. I'm very sorry about it, very sorry, because for young people it's just unacceptable for this to add to all the other pressures that they have in their lives. I have a son, he's 22 years old, he's in his last year at college. When he was growing up, which sort of coincided with the beginning of the smartphone and all of that stuff, I actually did put on limits. Certainly he didn't have a phone all the time, and he was not allowed to have a phone, a laptop, any device in his room. So nothing at night, and really only in quite managed circumstances. Obviously things, you know, the older he got, the more space around it there was. But even I get stressed out if my phone or my laptop or anything is on loud alerts or bing, bing, bing. Mine is silent. I don't have these notifications. And the phone I have, which I don't have it on me right now, my actual phone, which I carry around with me, does not have my work email on it, and it doesn't have social media on it.
Well, I have no problem because I always lose my phone.
Yeah, so I do have obviously a work iPad, and I have a team that lets me know the stuff that I need to know about in the social media sphere. I mean, I do my social media, but my social media is really about my show and my work and stuff like that. But I do think, again, I really hope that people can start managing their own social media use and their own use of these devices, because wherever I go, honestly, and it's all ages.
Yeah.
All ages. You know, nobody can sit in a restaurant without instead of looking around or whatever, this. Nobody can be in a bus or on a public transport or anywhere, this. It is also addictive.
Yeah.
And that's the tragedy of this. These young people have not had the opportunity yet, or they've not had the instruction yet it's like a drug. You have to limit your intake. If you drink too much wine, you're going to be an alcoholic. If you take too many drugs, you're going to be a drug addict. That's what this is. Psychologists will tell you that it has already affected the whole neural pathways and the chemistry. You have to be able to manage it in a way that's useful to you without being destructive to you. And the truth of the matter is, you don't need all that information. You're not going to be left out. You don't need it. You have to curate the information now in the same way you would as if you were, you know, choosing what to eat or what sports to do or where to go or what party or whatever. You really do have to curate your intake. Otherwise, it's going to be a destructive influence, as you've just said, which is terribly sad.
You're going to speak tomorrow in I guess your conclusions, but You've gotten all the intake of all of the negative. Is there any self-imposed? Do the students, what you're saying, you have to limit? A person should limit and put boundaries. Are you getting any of that back, or is that just an adults saying, put down your phone, you should have boundaries? Or do the students, again, these are brush strokes, but is there any kind of awareness?
Tomorrow you'll hear from students from both Greece and
now.
America. But
we
right
want
now,
it now.
Can you give us a few?
But right now they are, and I am so proud of the fact of how mature they are, knowing the times of day where they choose to engage. Sometimes not in the morning, so it doesn't affect their early morning classes.
Yes.
And I think, but any additional insight like you've offered.
So for instance, I used to tell my team, because they're all much younger than me, so I'm a different generation with different habits. Mm-hmm. They just used to wake up and there was like 10 WhatsApp messages at 6 in the morning or 7 when I got out of bed. I told them, no, just stop it. Unless it's a breaking news situation that I need to get out of bed, get my clothes on and go and work, I'm not at work yet. I'm going to go do my gym, I'm going to go play my sport, and then when it's time to go to work, I'll go to work and I'll be fully engaged. Or if you need me, you pick up the phone and you call me, then I'll know it's important and I have to engage. But I was getting stressed out, I couldn't get out of my bed.
But nobody calls anymore, they text.
Yeah.
I mean, the phone is ancient.
I love the phone, I love talking to people. And I love listening to their
I'll call you
tones.
after this, we'll talk.
Of what?
I'll call you after this, we'll talk.
I mean, you can't conduct relationships by text.
Yeah, I'm
Business or personal?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Tell me about it.
Well, so we'll look forward to tomorrow. I want to just wrap up with a couple things here. We talked about the global decline in journalism. And do you believe that that correlates with the global, I know what the answer is, so how does it correlate with the global decline in democracy? How do you correlate?
Well, I think there is a decline in journalism, but I do think there are still many standout organizations, such as my own, that really, it's a matter of life and death. It's a matter of life and death to get it right. And I think people can get some hope out of that. You might not like it all the time, and you might have complaints, that's fine. It's a 24/7 network, and there'll be complaints. But there are very serious, places in order to get the news. But there is a problem because this highly partisan environment that we live in, you see, journalists in many parts of the world are being pushed into the political extremes as well. And usually in parts of the world that don't have, a constitution or a free press, they're used as political pawns in many parts of the world. And we saw that in the Arab Spring. We see, so many journalists are having to, toe the government line or else find themselves in jail. And that is adding to the extremity of this whole thing. And that is also adding to the decline in the public sphere and in the democratic sphere. So it's very tough. I mean,
it used
is
to
very
be
tough.
that journalists were supposed to be neutral. I've heard your response to
Yes.
that, so
Well,
let them have it.
I got 5 minutes on neutrality. No. Neutrality, in my view, is not a good word when it comes to what we do. Because neutrality implies that all sides, all things are equal, and that there is no this or that. It's all here. So let's take Bosnia, for instance, because that was my formative experience, and that's why I always turn to it, formative professionally and personally. Because I had to make choices, and I had to make decisions which were journalistic choices and therefore personal choices. It's where I got my education as a full-formed human being and a fully formed journalist. Because I witnessed, as I said, the first genocide in Europe in front of my eyes, 24/7, since World War II. And I had to make a decision because I was being criticized for, quote-unquote, taking the side of the Muslims, i.e. the Sarajevans, who weren't all Muslim, by the way. It was the most ethnically mixed city and location in all of that part of the world. But that was the criticism I got. So I had to think to myself, oh my gosh, I am being criticized for violating, allegedly, our golden rule, which is objectivity. So I quickly understood, oh, hang on a second, objectivity is not neutrality. Objectivity means giving all sides a hearing, and a fair hearing, and exploring all sides, but not then concluding falsely that there's either a physical or a moral equivalence.
Yeah.
When you do that, you are dealing in lies. So maybe a modern equivalent of that would be the climate crisis. So many young people rightly feel that this is all of us feel, this is our existential issue. And none of our politicians and none of our leaders have dealt with it in a way that could be saving us right now from being held hostage by fossil fuel bad guys, in this case, somebody who launched a war and then wants to hold the rest of the world accountable and hostage to by cutting off energy, maybe we would be in a better place if our leaders had been more serious about alternatives decades ago. They were enabled not just by the lobbies of the fossil fuel and the lies, just like tobacco, the lies that the fossil fuel industry told the world. Guess who enabled it? Partly the press. Because maybe they weren't at that time educated enough, but mostly because they believed that objectivity meant equating 0.9% deniers and alternative facts with 99% fact and science on the environment.
That's exactly the point I wanted
That is
you
the
to
point.
nail.
So that's called false equivalence. That some people believe is how journalists should be, neutral or impartial. What the heck does that mean? You have to define the words, and you have to be serious about the words, and you have to be serious as a journalist, as an organization, as a profession, about what you're actually involved in. Here, you're involved in an existential crisis to us, human beings, not to the planet, because our planet will survive and will regenerate even if we're not here. Probably better if we're not here. Probably better if we're not here. But we have brought this upon ourselves by refusing to tell the truth for decades. And it's catastrophic now. It's just catastrophic. And we are literally watching ourselves being held hostage by those who would use fossil fuel and energy to hold us hostage, which is what they're doing around. Everybody is going to be suffering this winter with high energy costs. And then what will that mean in terms of continuing to support the forces of democracy and freedom against the forces of revanchism and totalitarianism? Seriously, it's that big. We have a huge responsibility to tell the truth. And impartiality and neutrality does not always equal truth.
That's exactly what I wanted to hear
Yeah.
you say, because I've heard you say it before, and
Yeah.
it's so powerful. I am going to close with the one, it's the superpower. What's the one piece of advice? There's no one piece of advice. There's no silver bullet. Like what are you going to do to save the world, or with journalism? But what's the truest thing you could say about your profession and what you would want these the students and their experienced journalists, long-time journalists also.
I would like everybody to really believe that this is a noble profession and that it actually can change the world. And maybe not always save the world, but it can change the world for the better and for the worse. So we have to make a decision as to whether we're going to use this phenomenal tool, because, in the past, I guess money was maybe it still is, but there have been big centers of power throughout our civilization. The current center of power is information. Whoever has the information or can manipulate the information is the most powerful. It's not money and capitalism and all the rest of it.
Say that again. That's really important.
That's what I think.
Information or manipulate. What? Say that again.
Well, I think that the biggest and most important and most powerful currency in the world is information. And that has been exponentially increased because of social media. So information can, be harnessed for saving the world, or it can be harnessed to destroy the world. And we're at that place right now. And all of you, students who decide to be journalists, established journalists, we have to believe that that's where we are. And every day, every minute, every choice we make is either to help or to hinder. And, that's a choice I make every single day. That's why I didn't put on my veil with the Iranian president. Because if I'd put on that
tell
veil...
that story before we leave.
So there's an uprising in Iran, and I had an exclusive interview with the Iranian president in New York. And as probably all of you know, the uprising is because a young woman of 22 was arrested by the so-called morality police that this particular hardline regime in Iran empowered more than the previous more reform-minded regime. And so they have been battling and preserving their power on the bodies of women and women's freedom. And this woman just turned up in Iran. She's from the north. She's from the Kurdish area. She'd come with her family, her mother, her father, her brother, to visit relatives in the capital, emerges from a subway station and is pounced upon. And it turns out that clearly she was roughed up, taken into custody, given a lecture on how to be dressed morally, and then again, journalists, two brave female Iranian journalists, somehow got the picture of this woman, Mahsa Amini, in hospital, showing herself in physical distress. There was blood, there was bruises, something had happened to this woman. She didn't just drop dead, as the authorities claim. So anyway, this is going on. Remember, journalists brought this to the world. Journalists brought this to the world. This is an important fact. Female journalists brought this to the world. So anyway, I had the opportunity to speak to the Iranian president about all of this when he was at the UN, and they decided to ask me to wear a veil in order to have this interview, and it's unprecedented. I've never had to wear a veil to interview anybody outside of their own country, like Iran or Afghanistan or whatever. It's not the law in New York. It's not my role as a journalist to cave to a foreign government's demand. And I basically said no. I said no, and I lost my exclusive. I didn't get my interview.
Yeah, but you got an awareness, and what I've heard you say, an awareness of the faces of women, ordinary, just regular, ordinary people, women, and who become leaders. You don't always have to be at the head of the line to be a leader. Right. You don't have to have a title like a CEO. You don't have to be in the C-suite. You have to be a woman, a man, or a woman of courage and conviction. And women are stepping up to the plate.
In Iran and all over the world. It's really interesting. I just say one other thing, because we've been talking about trust and politics and partisanship. The decision I took was not a political decision. It was entirely a decision of journalistic principle, that I was not, as a free, independent member of the Western American news profession with a constitutional protection of freedom of expression, I was not going to allow an authoritarian, religious government, or any government, tell me what to do.
And that goes right back to where I started with you, which will end with the beginning of my introduction, which is bravery is the strength and the characteristic that shines through you. And that was the moral bravery I was talking about, just like the physical bravery in Bosnia.
Thank you.
You are, she's just one hell of a woman, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. That was lovely.
Good?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Oh.